Okay, before we get to the next chapter, I just want to reiterate, just in case you were one of the folks that didn't watch the entire lengthy previous video, that by the time you finish with the exercises, you should have, your sheet should have tabs that look like this, basically. So the original data, the pivot table you made, the form that you made, the geocoding exercise, and then the last three are from the VLOOKUP. Your pivot table should look something like this. So for the homework, do this exercise. You'll be sharing the link to me. So make sure that you set the visibility so that I can actually see it. So this is the initial, what it looks like. So make sure that you click that, switch it to anybody or anyone with the link, and that way I'll be able to actually see your thing. Okay, so chapter 3 is broken into basically this. So strategies to guide your data search, all the way through questioning and recognizing the limitations of the data itself. So this is less of a technical thing and more about thinking through what you have going on here. So I'm going to pause it for just a moment. Okay, so the first part of this is actually really good for you thinking about what data that you'll use for your project. So this is starting with the framework of you have something that you want to answer. So if you're thinking about questions about equity, for example, then you need to narrow down that question specifically, such as I want to see all of the reported instances of violence towards Asian American people from the last 3 years, so we can track to see if there's a difference starting March of 2020, for example. So you start with like a broader question, narrowed it down to something very, very specific. For the project, you might really just shop in Kaggle or whatever to see what data exists, because I don't expect you to go to the lengths of, I have this question and there's no data, and therefore I need to like create a survey and gather my data. We're not doing all that in this class. But this is generally very good information of how to consider the question, revise the question as you need, consider like if that was the research question, what organizations collect and publish the data for that. So instances of reporting violence, you know, would you be looking for police reports? Maybe, maybe not. There's public places that collect that kind of information. There's non-public places like at SBU, there's a reporting thing, that portal, that the data isn't necessarily available to random person on the street. So there's a lot of like smaller databases that are private. So you have to think about who has what data that you're trying to think about, right? And how those questions are asked and so on. The levels of information or data, if you're looking at like census level information, or you're like, the government has a ton of data out there that you can download, but it's usually aggregated. A lot of times it's not raw data, which makes it really hard to do any visualization with. It's basically there, like you can do, like it's there so that you can do like high level data viz, not like detail data viz. So it's a lot of times not really suitable for what we would want necessarily. If you're thinking in the you can definitely look at data sets that have been used by other people for other data vizes and seeing if you can trace back where they got their data from. That is always good practice when it's not your data, is to figure out where it's from. That way you can think about who's collecting it and for what purpose. A lot of times the people who are collecting the data are not neutral. So that's always a good question to be thinking about. And then, of course, if you are looking for data that doesn't exist yet, you can go about collecting it yourself. Again, out of scope for this class. Hopefully you're enjoying the references to data feminism here, since as a school, we read it a couple of quarters ago. And so hopefully you can bring those thoughts into how you're thinking about getting your data and for your data visualizations. The next section here talks about the debates between public and private data. The big brother idea of we're always being watched by people collecting information on us. It's accurate for today, right? Like, I did one search on the parallels for Mac for y'all, and then the next YouTube video I watch, I got an ad for it. I don't even have a Mac. It's all connected. They're all collecting and sharing information with each other. There's been a lot of controversy around this type of information. And things are always changing. Like, for example, when they first started doing the DNA testing for the like 23andMe, where you can go get your blood tested to see, if, what percentage of what ethnic racial groups you have in your ancestry. Then they started letting the police have access to this information, which helped track down a bunch of like murderers and stuff. But now the data usage terms have changed for the people who originally signed up for that service. People weren't banking on someone using their blood to track down their cousin for a murder. So things like that you need to be aware of, especially if you're dealing with data that is more sensitive in nature. So just be aware of the controversies and thinking about that when you're thinking about collecting your own data or accessing data, and paying attention to what the agreements were when the data was collected in the first place, just to make sure that you are following ethical practices, regardless of the source of where your data was. For example, the HR Kaggle data, that's all fake data. At least last time I looked for data, HR related data. They have real questions, like the columns are what you would normally see, but all the actual information is fake, so that nobody's identities are being stolen and such. These questions about protecting people are especially important when you're thinking about like psychology field has a lot of times we're collecting stuff. The medical field, this example that they provide in here about crime reports. So the way that they're handling it is either masking the details. So here they're talking about how police departments hide the last few digits of the street addresses to help prevent that for people actually tracking down the specific address. A lot of times in psychology surveys, what we do is you have a participant number, and it's everything associated with that, and all the other data that could otherwise identify an individual is stripped, so that if you look at any specific row, you won't be able to figure it out. But even when you do that, still think through the data. For example, if you looked through a survey of all the students in the IO psychology program today, if you're looking for somebody that was Asian American, a non-traditional age student, so just those two parameters within the IO program, there's only a handful of people that would show up there. If you had my specific age or even the decade in which I was born, you'd be able to identify me almost immediately. If you're just looking for Asian American and my cohort, immediate, even if you include the master's program. So always be aware of what parameters can identify people, and then thinking about how you can mask this. Right, they're talking about aggregating the data. That is typically what we end up doing. In the business world, in HR, what I've seen mostly done, for example, with employee engagement surveys, is if there's fewer than a number like 7 in a category, then you don't even show that category. Like, you can only show categories that have enough people in it that you can't identify a specific person. This is especially important if there's, in a company context, with like feedback reports, if there's comments being made, open-ended questions, because people's voice, their writing voices, can often be easily identified by their managers, especially if they've been working there for a long time, especially if they're more vocal, right? Or if they have certain ways of typing, certain speech patterns per se. So think through all of these things when you're looking at your data. Consider, is the data sensitive? Could anyone be identified or harmed by the data? And just think through every single little piece of that, just to make sure that we're protecting our participants, especially those who didn't know that they were participating in your data viz. This next page talks about open data repositories. So we've said Kaggle several times in here, and I put the link in the PowerPoint, or the address anyways. But there's plenty of other places to get data, and here are a bunch of them. Some of those might only provide aggregated data instead of nice raw data. So explore, see what's interesting to you for your project. A lot of these can spark really interesting data viz about the real world right now, versus Kaggle is going to have all sorts of random data that a lot of it's just for fun. Yeah, and sometime here I'll show you a little bit about what I did for my project, just so that you can see. But yeah, it doesn't really matter what data you choose for your project, as long as it's suitable for the visualizations that we need to do. This next page is good recommendations and data practice. So if you go back to your spreadsheet that you made earlier, and again, my tabs are visible. The third tab in there, in this part of it, was their source data. So this is exactly what they were talking about. They have a location from where in the world that they get their stuff. So that's one really good way of handling this. For your project, you will need to tell me where you got the data from, including a link so that I could go download the same data and replicate your steps. A lot of times when I'm doing data stuff from the data cleaning process, especially the data cleaning process, I will have a tab in my data like this that is for all of the data cleaning processes. So I will have something like step per purpose, like columns like that, so that I can keep track, so I know what in the world I did. This is especially important if you expect to revisit the same data. For example, the data for my dissertation, we've been working with the same data set since my second year of grad school, using multiple platforms and all sorts of stuff. And so those data cleaning notes in the front of it, because I have a sheet like that, is super critical, from renaming columns all the way through. So keep a notes, including your data source, just like they recommended here. File names are always, yeah, make sure that you save your things with appropriate file names. That's not something that I will check for, but just good practice for yourself. And then the third thing that they say here about making a backup of your original data is always key. I usually have in my naming convention something like my data set for my dissertation is CCL data. So it's like CCL_original. And I never touch that data ever again. Like I copy it, clean it. The clean data set has its own CCL clean, and then I copy that, and then I do my analyses in a third set. So I have multiple copies, which is a little redundant, but it's just for safety so that nothing happens. Yeah, so develop a system for yourself. Make sure that you keep your information in a way that you'll be accessible to yourself in the future. The next section here about recognizing bad data is really important for you to consider as you're looking at your data sets, especially if you're using something like Kaggle. The quality of the data can be a little random, to say the least. So here's a lot of really common ones. Missing values. So even just looking at, I'm gonna get rid of that one. Looking at the form responses here, we had a lot of missing values in all of the fields except for the timestamp, actually. So we're missing names, missing locations, missing data like experience. You can ask yourself questions around this, like, did they say 0 because, or did they not fill it out because they don't have any experience, so they mean 0, or did they leave it blank because they just didn't want to answer the question, right? Those are two very different circumstances if we're thinking about experience with data viz as the average, and if we're trying to do analysis with anything else, like if we're trying to look at like the average experience with data viz per country based off the location, assuming that this was cleaned up, the do not responds is very different than the zeros, right? Yeah, so that makes a huge impact. And if you fill this in with 0, making an assumption, you might be corrupting what is true. So we need to think about what is missing and why from these. Here we're talking about missing leading zeros. The way that your data is entered can mess things up a lot, like timestamps. If this is converted into numbers instead of time, it would do bad things, right? So you need to be aware of the data types in here, and if you're ever wanting to check this stuff, so here it has all the different formats that it could be, and they have even more in here. So if you need to change things, be here can see Google Sheets. Do show me. Might not be able to get a quick read on the data type. Hold on a second. Let me see that real quick. Okay, quick Google search has not revealed the answer to me. I think you actually have to just use logic in that. But just recognizing like that looks like, well, it kind of looks like a date and time. Yeah, but you can see that if you format, like do an automatic, it changes it completely, right? So you got to make sure that you know what you're looking at, basically. So it gives us an example about leading zeros for the zip codes. So if you entered in zip codes in here and had it as formatted as numbers, it would get messed up. You'd have to set it, I think probably to text to get that to work correctly. Yeah. What was I thinking? Oh, in this particular example, we have bad data in here in that you have years of school. I'm guessing that these people aren't saying that they never went to any school at all. I'm guessing that they probably made an assumption about like years after high school graduation or something like that, right? Same thing, did these people just graduate 6th grade or possibly 4th grade, depending on where they started counting years of school? Probably not. So years of school is one of these things where I've seen a lot of times in surveys, there's just a lot of bad data here because you don't know if you didn't define the question well in your form when you made this. So years of school, if you want people to be telling you the number of years of school starting from preschool, you need to say that. If you're looking for the number of years of school after high school graduation, making the assumption that everyone in your survey has at least graduated that, then that's what you need to say. So you need to look through the data and make sure that there's nothing that doesn't make sense whatsoever in there. Like stuff like this. Web link, no. Thanks, that was super helpful. Facebook. Okay, that's not a web link. So these are things that you need to do the handle in your data cleaning. And so looking through your data, talking about geocoding as one of the common things as well. So you need to recognize those bad data. Sometimes it's just getting a habit of this as you're working with data. And very similarly in this questionnaire data of making sure that your columns actually are what you think that they mean. My dissertation, I have 4 columns of identification numbers that I have no idea what they mean, have never figured it out. All the strategies, like one of them totally unique numbers that's different from the other unique ID numbers. No idea what there's 2 different columns of unique ID numbers. Did they provide like good explanations? You know, is there a sheet that has the metadata that explained what these column headers mean? No, and that's really common in data that you download from other places. So lesson in making sure that you are documenting things well, not only sourcing your data, but also questioning what they mean and really exploring that when you're not sure. All right, that wraps up this. These are always excellent questions to be asking yourself as you're looking at your data, especially when you're considering data that is A, downloaded from other places, and B, the more sensitive the data is, the more you need to be thinking about these types of things. And sensitive, I'm thinking about things like if you're looking at like anything that's involving like race, for example. You know, we know, like, it's very obvious that there's a lot of issues in how things have occurred through history, who is providing the data, how it's being collected, all these different things. You know, even things like you know, everything that's talking about here, how things are defined over time. There's so many different pieces in there that we need to think about. So yeah, so for your projects, make sure that you're thinking through all those pieces. And if you are making your own surveys, not for this class, but for any other class or in real life, thinking about how, like if you're using the default demographic questions, consider if your platform, SurveyMonkey or whatever, is using outdated things or written in a way that you want your company to be driving forward in the future. You know, if your organization only provides a question saying, what is your gender, male or female? Then you might want to push them to provide more modern thinking on that, and provide people with other options, because that's not the only ways people identify with themselves anymore. So all those little pieces. Okay, so that wraps up chapter 3, find and question your data.